I have. I'm just going to make a confession here at this point, but to set up a question. I have been thrown out of an organization called the Marxist Humanist Initiative, so I'm no longer involved with the Marxist Humanist Initiative. But you may know Andrew Kleinman. I know you know who Andrew Kleinman is. Yeah, and for someone who is coming from that perspective, the notion that value, the labor theory of value, could hold in a society without market forces is a bit of a puzzle, right? But I wonder if this might be a good time for you to tell me about how you think, and it goes into my question I sent you about equality, about how you started your book on the new socialism based on the question of inequality. Do you think that in Maoist China, if there had been less private ownership, that there would have been a way to create a system of through a planned economy where people would receive back from the society what they put into it in terms of their labor time?
Well, that was what was actually directly put into practice in the countryside in the communes.
Mm-hmm. Right. How was that done? Was that done with like labor certificates? That was like 1 hour of work equals one labor certificate?
Points that were registered. I don't know whether it was days work or hours work.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers and listeners. You're about to watch an interview with Paul Cockshott. Cockshott is a computer scientist. He is a reader at the University of Glasgow. And since 1993, he's authored many books, most notably Towards a New Socialism. In the second half, in the Parrot Room, you'll hear more of the conversation, and it will start off with a conversation around the critique of the Gotha program and labor certificates and just how socialism might work.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life. Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we still,
to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Yeah, the first question is, how did you come to be a Marxist?
Firstly, I was already from early teenage years a social democrat because my stepfather was a Labour Party member and became, whilst I was at school, a Labour MP. Mm-hmm. And there were lots of, actually, I later realised, I didn't realise this as a schoolboy, that he had lots of books on the shelves which were actually Marxist books, which I didn't read until I went to university. Mm. I was influenced in my later years at school by the Cultural Revolution in China and the events in Paris in '68, because those happened when I was still at school. So that the first thing I did when I went to university, which was actually in Canada, was to join the first student group I saw that had a left-wing stall out on the freshest day.
So were you in university in Canada in May of '68?
No, I was at school in 68. I went to university in 69.
What is your memory? Because I'm very interested in, I was born in 70, so it's not as though May of 68 is a living memory for me, but it is I think of it as one of the last moments where the idea of revolution in the developed world seemed plausible. Seemed like it
no. It was much more plausible in 1975 in Portugal.
This was May Day in Lisbon, 1 week after the regime of Marcelo Caetano was destroyed in a military coup. An infectiously happy people celebrated the restoration of freedoms taken from them almost 50 years ago.
That's exactly what Bordiga predicted in 1945.
Oh yeah, tell me more about that.
Well, he said there's a democratic euphoria has overtaken Europe after 45, and it will take 30 years, and the first serious attempt at a socialist revolution in Europe won't occur until 1975. He died in 72.
And what did he mean by democratic euphoria exactly?
Well, you got to realize that Bordiga was more Leninist than Lenin. Okay, that the Communist Party of Italy, when he led it, had a principle of abstention from elections. That he regarded the electoral system as a fraud, and that it was just a disguised form of the dictatorship of capital, and that the effect of the overthrow of Mussolini was to generate a revived belief in the old state system.
Okay. But in 68 in Paris, there wasn't really an electoral component to the actions in the streets with the workers.
But the reason why it was nothing like as serious as the situation in Portugal was that to have a revolution, you need a mass movement, yes, but you also, and this is absolutely critical, you need the army to mutiny. And Portugal, the army mutinied as a result of effectively being defeated in the long war in Angola and Mozambique. And it was revolutionary soldiers that created the opportunity there. Now, in fact, Social Democrats, the Socialist Party, turned it back into just constitutional capitalist state. But there was real possibility of a state of workers' councils there because there actually was equivalent of military Soviets.
Okay, but when you were a young man before the revolutionary efforts in Portugal, you were still inspired by the 68, and you were learning. You were just beginning to.
As a schoolboy, and probably the year before, watching the Cultural Revolution in China and getting a copy of the Little Red Book. I mean, at that stage, it was the first Marxist text I actually read. It wasn't until I went to university that I started to read other things.
When I was a younger man, back in the early 90s, I discovered the Situationist International and started to read Guy Debord and I read about the 68. That was how the ideas and the history of May of 68 in Paris came to me. It was through books on the Situationists, which included like Rael Marcus's book, Lipstick Traces, which was this. It's like a book about punk rock. Yeah, right. I mean, you wouldn't know it necessarily. It's not a significant political book. It's a book about culture and pop culture.
Originally, I heard about the Situationists when I was at art school, looking for a cause, like every other rebel without one.
When it became time in the mid-70s to change pop music, when pop fans like Malcolm McLaren and Jamie Reed were disgusted, bored to death with the deadness of pop life, Situationist notions of change, of outrage, of excess were a lot of what drove them to try and create the Sex Pistols.
I thought of May 68 as a revolution inspired by this little, art group in Paris, but there was a major Maoist component to the...
There was a Maoist component, yes. A strong Maoist component, because it was occurring at the time of the Cultural Revolution. And that had an enormous intellectual impact beyond China.
And what was most exciting to you about the Cultural Revolution in China?
Well, you got to take into account that you gradually learned about, or I gradually learned about it, or people in the West gradually learned about it. First, all you saw was these big demonstrations and news broadcasts of what was going on. Only later did you start reading things published in China, like the Peking Review. It wasn't until I started to read that, and also some of the comments, the analysis of it by the French Maoist groups. I'm now talking about 73, 74, what they were saying about it, there was, the ideas would be gradually filtering through to the rest of the world what it really meant in terms of having control of factories and things being by committees rather than by the old managers, and the slogans and being masters of the wharf, not slaves to production, for instance, from the dockers.
So you look back on the Cultural Revolution now as a moment where something like workers' councils and worker control was beginning to happen?
Yes, it was. The problem is they didn't actually settle on a state form that was suitable.
Mm-hmm.
The state form that would be required would be some form of direct democracy. And there was no attempt to actually have a overthrow of the PRC constitution towards that. You can't have a political movement, a revolutionary political movement, unless it has definite constitutional aims of changing the existing constitution as it exists, as it stands. And they didn't have that. It was ad hoc struggles at each particular point, but unless you change the constitution, overthrow the then existing constitution, the possibility to revert back remained. Because if you read the PRC constitution, it is very, very close to the model of constitution that is set out as the archetypal workers' council hierarchical Soviet-type constitution. It's local elections to local bodies, which then elect people to, from county level to a larger level, and etc. Now, that became the orthodoxy for what a Marxist constitution could be as a result of Marx's writing on the Civil War in France. But what he's describing there is actually the program of the French Proudhonists, which was an updated version of the what was achieved in the first French Revolution. It's essentially a hierarchical election system. But the problem with the hierarchical election system is it gives an enormous advantage to whichever political party is the largest, because each layer of the hierarchy increases the disproportionate share of that party.
We're just about to publish an essay on the Cultural Revolution next week, I think. It's written by a man who is Chinese and who lived through it as a boy. And he describes the Cultural Revolution as coming out of the failures of the Great Leap Forward. And he describes the fighting and the disorder that he saw during the Cultural Revolution in kind of vivid detail. And he thinks of the difficulties that the failure of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward as arriving because the internal culture of the party was not democratic enough, that there wasn't a process of internal critique, there was a process of evaluation that was cut short, and that a culture of conformity and arose where there should have been a culture of collective thinking through of problems. What would you make of that?
I get your point. The problem is that it's a mistake to focus just on discussions within a party. It has to be something that involves the whole population. And that was something which the Cultural Revolution was starting and was involving people outside the party. But they didn't settle on a form of constitution which wouldn't repeatedly allow the established party bureaucracy to completely dominate it. Although the PRC constitution appears a very democratic constitution, its fatal flaw is the hierarchical character of the election system. And the nonsense that if you look at what most leftists in Britain or America were saying as critique of the USSR way back in the 70s or later than that, what they were saying, they needed to establish a proper Soviet democracy. And by that, they mean the system of hierarchical elections, which was advocated by Lenin in State and Revolution, but that is actually what they had. And that's what the Chinese certainly had, and that accentuates the power of a well-established party. So,
so what kind of democratic system would you think should have been outlined again in the in a functional constitution?
The key principle has to be that representative bodies are selected by lot, not by election. Otherwise, you always get dominance by the most prepared and those with what nowadays people say had the most social capital.
this is a selection by lot would be kind of a random approach to selecting.
Yes, it has to be random. But if you consider any scientific sampling process, you always do it randomly. If you consider any surveying company that wants to find out what the population's view is, or if you're trying to do, a medical trial or anything like that, you always have to take a randomly.
Right, but on the other hand, if you have to have a surgery performed,
you wouldn't want what?
Yeah, if you're going to undergo surgery, you don't want to select your surgeon by lot.
But that's not politics. That is that's particular technical skills.
Right.
You don't elect surgeons either.
No, we don't. And the idea, I guess there's just something's crept into contemporary politics, which is the idea that politicians are policy experts, or they're referred to.
I have a plan for Medicare for all. I have a plan.
What the experts tell us is that one of the reasons that we are unprepared and have been unprepared is we don't have a system.
Your education's incredible. You're a military man, lauded as a mayor. But were you specifically interested in transportation, or was it one of those things that we think you'd be a good fit, and then you do the diligence to get prepared?
Yeah, no, I mean, when you're a mayor, you live and breathe transportation in so many ways, right? Because it's the lifeblood of a city.
Anytime we do anything, we try to learn from experience. We learned a lot from the first program from your comments. First, you wanted better charts that you could see the fine print on, and you'll have those tonight.
If you're going to say anything that you need experts, well, the Chinese Communist Party works that way.
Right.
I mean, the people who, that's what the Chinese Communist Party would say, that the people who are at the head of the party arrive at that through going through a very rigorous selection process of being tested as political leaders at a local scale, and then a city scale, and then at a provincial scale before they're trusted to do anything at a national level. So if you want political experts, well, that's the system that'll give it to you.
My understanding of the Cultural Revolution was that it was aimed at stamping out bourgeois ideology, and creating a proletarian or a communist culture, and unleash. But you're suggesting, and this is important to underscore, that it was beyond that, also aiming to turn over the productive capacities of China to the workers.
It's absolutely central. If you read the propaganda that was being published in Peking Review or China Reconstructs, if you go and look at back issues of those from the early 70s, from 69 to 72, that was very definitely what they were on about.
Okay.
That you could increase production more by harnessing the knowledge and initiative of shop floor workers.
Do you believe that the cultural side, the effort to stamp out ideological experts or the bourgeois culture was a necessary component to a process of collectivizing and turning over the factories and the workplaces to the workers?
Well, yes, because you couldn't realize that until 67 or 68, until the start of the Cultural Revolution, China was still running a mixed economy. It was running a social democratic mixed economy. There was a large private capitalist sector. That was what Mao, following Lenin, called state capitalists. That is to say, they were capitalists, but they had to meet certain objectives set by the state.
Mm-hmm.
But they still,
and there was a lot of false reporting
Sorry?
There was a lot of false reporting about meeting those objectives. I've heard that
false reporting.
Yeah, people would say, "Oh, yeah, we've met our quota. We're exceeding our quota." But
that's separate from the issue I'm talking about.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the fact that the ownership of a large part of the industry in China was still private until the end of the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And
they would be paid by the state.
No, they were running factories, and they were selling the product
to the state, right?
No. Some of it would go to the state, some would go to other factories. Some would be sold directly to consumers.
Okay. All right.
It wasn't a Soviet-type economy.
Right. Okay.
There was a state sector, but that coexisted alongside a private sector. And this was reverted to by Deng after Mao died. What Deng was doing was reverting to the system that had existed up until 1966. Now, one of the things of the Cultural Revolution was they nationalized industry.
Okay.
It wasn't till then that the actual private bourgeoisie were expropriated. So it wasn't just culture, it was economics as well.
The economic reforms during the Great Leap Forward increased centralized state control, to the extent that private ownership became virtually impossible. By 1956, approximately 2/3 of industrial enterprises were state-owned, while the remainder were jointly owned. Rigid central planning and national demands often resulted in local needs being neglected, especially in the countryside. While 84% of the population lived in rural areas, 88% of government investment was pumped into heavy industry in towns and cities. The state monopoly on grain and the impact of collectivization also caused disruption and dissatisfaction in rural areas in the mid-1950s. Many questioned whether the struggling countryside could feed the rapidly expanding cities. As the state diverted grain supply, grain reserves fell, causing food shortages and hunger in some places. New farming techniques and technologies, used with success elsewhere in Asia, were largely ignored.
Okay, so the Great Leap Forward then was not a process of collectivizing and taking up through the state the say the agricultural sector of society or the industrial side. It was not controlled. It was a mixed economy, a mixed economic model.
The Great Leap Forward was an agricultural issue. Okay, it was a countryside issue. It was setting up communes as combined local industry, small-scale local industry and agriculture in larger units than collective farms. And within which the actual production relations were not wage labor. And they had a work point system that people were given labor credits for the amount of work they did, and then the harvest was then devoted in proportion to that.
Right. And the industrial sector was mixed. It was some of it was state controlled, some of it was privately owned. Is that right?
The state sectors, but there were state sectors where there was new state investment in new industries. But the old, what we call the progressive national bourgeoisie, the ones who had sided with the CPC run with the Kuomintang, were allowed to keep their factories. Those who'd sided with the Kuomintang had their factories confiscated.
Okay. So it sounds to me like, as we've discussed this, that you hold on to a great deal of the Maoism that you came across in your youth, that you are still looking back on it, rightly so, to critically, but also with some hope in certain aspects of that history, right?
The political strength of the left and of workers suffered heavily in China in the late 70s. And this reflected a split that had always been in the CPC because of the nature it had of a patriotic alliance against the Japanese, that it had within it sections were supportive of the progressive national bourgeoisie and supported the private ownership. And if you look back at the polemic that took place between the Chinese and the Russians in the early 60s, and you will see that in the Cultural Revolution, Liu Shaoqi is accused of being China's Khrushchev. Actually, the critique of Khrushchev a few years earlier should be seen in the light of a critique by Mao and Zhou Enlai's wing of the Communist Party of Liu Shaoqi's wing of the Communist Party. Rather than openly critique Liu Shaoqi, they attack Khrushchev. And the code is that what Khrushchev is advocating is a sign for what Liu Shaoqi is advocating, and the opposition to Khrushchev is an opposition to Liu Shaoqi's economic policies.
Was there some alliance? Was there some alliance between Khrushchev and Lee?
No. The point is that from Khrushchev onwards, there was in Russia and in Eastern Europe an ideological process of re-justifying the market and extending market economy mechanisms. And this is heavily criticized in the documents of what we call the critique of the general line of the communist movement. And these I think I now believe, well, last I heard that they were written by either Zhou Enlai or by Mao. And these economic policies are heavily critiqued. And the most clear critique of them comes up when they criticize the most developed form of that, which is in Tito's Yugoslavia. And if you go back, I no longer have copies of them, but you could find them in the library. If you go back to the Chinese Communist Party's critique of Tito's policies, this is essentially a critique of the people who want to have a stronger market element in China. And those are the people who won out after 1975, the people who want a stronger market element, and to create what is essentially a mixed economy that they have in China. So the Chinese economy is like Harold.
I have, I'm just going to make a confession here at this point, but to set up a question. I have been thrown out of an organization called the Marxist Humanist Initiative. So I'm no longer involved with the Marxist Humanist Initiative, but you may know Andrew Kleinman. I know you know who Andrew Kleinman is. Yeah. And for someone who is coming from that perspective, the notion that value the labor theory of value could hold in a society without market forces is a bit of a puzzle, right? But I wonder if this might be a good time for you to tell me about how you think, and it goes into my question I sent you about equality, about how you started your book on the new socialism based on the question of inequality. Do you think that in Maoist China, if there had been less private ownership, that there would have been a way to create a system through a planned economy where people would receive back from the society what they put into it in terms of their labor time?
Well, that was what was actually directly put into practice in the countryside in the communes.
Mm-hmm. Right. How was that done? Was that done with like labor certificates? That was like 1 hour of work equals one labor certificate?
Points that were registered. I don't know whether it was days work or hours work.
Mm-hmm. But so go ahead.
This would be recorded, and people would be credited with that amount. And it was a largely in-kind system, that the share of the harvest and the locally produced goods that they got would be proportional to the labor they put in.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.